Welcome, everyone. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm an advisory board member at the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 24th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Our ongoing project is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address as we plan for the recovery and rebuilding that will be slow and long. This is also a good and important time to reimagine Canada. However, before we go on with today's program, I'd like to take a moment to thank our two sustaining sponsors who make these events possible. First is the Canada Buildings Trade Unions, and second, the International Association of Firefighters. So big thank you to both organizations. Today, our subject will be the public service, how it has performed over the past few months and what it means for the long-term future, both of the public service and of governments in Canada at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. We have four very knowledgeable panelists who will address these issues today. We have first David Bulmer, who is the president of AMAPCEO, Ontario's Professional Employees Union, which represents over 14,000 professionals. He comes to the organization from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and is also a board member of the Ontario Pension Board. Dave, welcome back to the Pearson Centre. We also have with us Linda Silas, who is the president of the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, which represents nearly 200,000 unionized nurses and nursing students across the country. Originally from New Brunswick, she is an RN herself and has been president of the CFNU since 2003. We also have with us today Stephen McKinnon, who's been a member of Parliament for Gatineau since 2015 and is Parliamentary Secretary for Public Services and Procurement. As an MP for the National Capital Region, who represents many public servants in his constituency, he's a regular proponent of the interests of public servants. And last but by no means least, we have with us Jim Miller, who's a principal with Connect Public Affairs. He's also a former director of policy to the Minister of HRSDC, Diane Finley, during the Harper administration. He's also a regular writer and blogger on public policy issues. The panel today will be moderated by Andrew Cardozo, who's the president of the Pearson Centre. With respect to the format, the panel discussion will last about 40 minutes and then be followed by a Q&A period before we end promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Please use the question box on your screen and we'll get to as many questions as we can. However, before I hand things over to Andrew, let me ask a question to all four panelists. And the question is as follows. What has struck you most about how governments and public servants at large, including nurses and teachers, have performed in response to COVID over the last few months? And I will call on panelists as I see them from left to right. So Dave, you go first.
Thanks, Francesca and Andrew and the Pearson Centre for having me. I think what struck me most is the success that remote work has been. In Ontario, about 30,000 of the 60,000 civil servants have been working remotely, and it's been, I believe, a tremendous success. I think it was actually a very good decision by federal and provincial jurisdictions to maintain the civil service, not only for the fundamental services that we provide, but because it's a backbone to the economy and stabilizing things and not making it worse by putting what are core jobs throughout Canada and specific cities like Ottawa and Toronto and so on, very key. My only concerns, I guess, Francesca, are that as the longer this goes, there's a real chance of burnout when people are having to not just work 8 hours a day, but as I refer to it as day parenting, when typically their child would be in education or daycare. And even as far back as this spring when some of my members were wearing a third hat by being tutors. So to the extent that we can measure and monitor that, I think remote work has been, and the success of it has been the best takeaway for me.
Great. Linda, your thoughts on the question?
Well, it's a two-prong. One, the positive one was how quickly the federal government acted. All due respect, Mr. McKinnon, federal government's a big machine, and anytime you want to bring changes, it takes eons. And everyone was focused and to help communities, provinces, territories. That was very impressive, and every day was exciting to watch the news. And also how they consulted with everyone, business, labor, again, communities. What stunned me is the lack of appreciation health and safety was needed in the healthcare sector. Late January, my first meeting with the Public Health Agency of Canada, I wasn't worried. We had many dress rehearsal for pandemic type from after our lessons from SARS. And then we had H1N1, MERS, and Ebola. I wasn't worried. I said, okay, we have this on. And then it fell off the rail, which I'll talk later. So it's really a two-pronged approach here, or concern here.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Jim, views?
Well, I think one of the things that I find interesting, I guess I'll sort of go to a two-pronged piece too, is sort of a positive and negative. And just to agree with Dave, I think that the remote working component worked really well. The in-person component, how much was where sort of there was a bit of a fall down, particularly in some of the public service, in the sense that they closed up citizens' access to services that the government would have. And I understand that public health, in the concerns for the workers and stuff like that. But at the same point in time, as we were beginning to reopen, the kid at Starbucks is making minimum wage and is going into work every day, whereas the Service Canada, Service Ontario outlets, where you have all these backlogs now. And people, not being able to get a driver's test or not being able to get particular services because these services weren't available. So there has to be a bit of a balance there. On the other part of the remote working component was that, they were able to move quickly to get, money out the door, and also the adaptation of technology that a lot of the public service is using in order to deliver services. Was really well handled, and people were working from home really well and able to be productive. But at the same point in time, it could be a catalyst for adopting and accelerating those technologies, I think. Just for example, at Employment and Social Development Canada, looking at EI modernization, which is something that's been mentioned as the possible focus of the throne speech. That's something that's been talking about for decades. So hopefully this can act as a catalyst for that and get it moving so that we can have that modernization occur.
Terrific, Jim. Thank you. Stephen.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Andrew and Francesca and the Pearson Center for having us today. And hello to my fellow panelists. Because the question specifically asks about nurses and teachers, and as a federal politician, I don't get to comment on that much. Let me just say that also as a father and a citizen, I am in amazement and at the dedication of nurses and teachers here in Gatineau and everywhere. And their commitment to service. There are some nurses doing sit-ins right now at the hospital in Gatineau because of some problems with staffing, and I want to express my solidarity to them. But more generally, I got to watch up close the dedication of our public service. Jim and others underscore some things that we'll no doubt want to come back and address. You talked about EI, and I would add a lot of the IT platforms and alternate service delivery capabilities of the government of Canada, and I'm sure other governments are going to want to be put under scrutiny. I was very nervous as someone who worked closely with Shared Services Canada at the capacity of that organization to deliver remote access. And I do want to lift my hat to the IT professionals that work at Shared Services, because that has gone mostly incredibly smoothly and certainly beyond anyone's expectations. But more generally, I've been witness to public servants pulling together literally from kitchen table to kitchen table, because they're all working from home, and really rising to some of the largest challenges of the age. The PPE challenge, the income support challenge, and so many other challenges that we have yet to even hear about that Canada's public servants have risen to. So I absolutely do not want that to go unnoticed and unspoken about, and I'm obviously committed to continue to speak on behalf of those people who I think we owe a big debt to.
Terrific. So thank you very much to the four of you. You've all provided fantastic answers to the first question, and I will turn it over to Andrew now for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Francesca. Let me build on Francesca's first question and ask you, and I'll start with you, Dave. How long do you think this will carry on for, and how do you think it will go?
I think this is going to have to carry on until we get to the point of a vaccination, Andrew. From an Ontario provincial civil service perspective, 50% of our staff are in the workplace, and we can only upstaff another 30% on top of that, and that's pushing it as far as it'll go. So I don't think we can completely return to the workplace until we get to a point where it's safe to do so, and a vaccination would be that for me.
And what's your sense of the efficiency that one is able to do? I mean, surely when people are working remotely and also having, especially over the past months, taking care of kids and all that, is it your sense that there's been a reduction in efficiency of individuals, sort of on the one hand, and on the other hand, in terms of delivering things like payments, whether it's EI or other kinds of things?
I think for my own group, and I don't mean this because they are my group, because of the work they do, I think they've pretty much turned out what they would in the office. We do very high level policy and program work, and are very suited to remote work. So I don't think there's been any substantial loss there. I would argue, much to my chagrin, some of my union members actually work longer days than they did in the office because they don't have the commute home. They don't mind sacrificing a few minutes to finish something from the day, and often need to know when they should move from the kitchen table to the couch, as Stephen mentioned, with where we have our offices now. I think there are definitely some grassroots things. Jim mentioned a couple that are suffering, that are backlogged, that we need to come up with creative ways to get caught up and to find a way so that we don't drown with really basic services like transportation and driver's licenses and things like that. But I think for the most part, our experience has been that people are working very effectively from home. And the only complaint they might have is the loss of social camaraderie, interaction, that sort of thing. But I think they're in it for the long haul, as are all dedicated public service members.
Yeah, Stephen, you represent a lot of public servants in Gatineau. What's your sense as to how they are managing with the current limitations, and how long do you think they can survive doing this?
Well, as I mentioned, I think we'll learn of some very heroic efforts being made by public servants. But I do worry, as Dave alluded to and others, I do worry about the mental toll that this takes. My wife is an occupational therapist. She reminds me every day that there will be an ergonomic toll, with people not sitting and being equipped with proper equipment or workspaces. There is a number of us are social animals. We express our creativity in teams. Certainly there are lots of people who like working alone. There are others who work best, whether they're in a team context or in a group context, across departments, on specific special projects. The government, as it does, has focused very intensely on COVID and on the pandemic and the related issues. There are a lot of other things, of course, the government of Canada and governments in Ontario and elsewhere must also look after, whether it's building roads or running prisons or running borders, or maybe not so much of that these days. But regardless, there are a lot of other functions of the government, and a lot of those people, I think, are feeling perhaps underappreciated or underutilized. So I think one of the things we're going to want to do as part of a post-mortem on this pandemic is ensure that the government can keep functioning in even those critical or non-urgent or non-emergency areas at an optimal level, which I think perhaps has not always been the case through this pandemic, and for understandable reasons. Government is very focused on managing this crisis and doing it well.
Yeah, just as a small point, is the government, for example, able to help people? You mentioned ergonomic issues, help them with either, I know a neighbor of mine had her desk chair brought home for her, but are you able to do that? Are you able to provide people an allowance, for example, to upgrade their bandwidth, because they're going to be using a lot more bandwidth these days? Have you gotten into that kind of system where you're providing workers with additional facilities at home?
I think there's been some of that. I think it's been largely ad hoc. And again, these are things that we're going to want to look into in a more systemic way. I think once this is over, I do want to put in a plug. Before the pandemic, the government of Canada has been moving aggressively from a position of wanting to do asset management and catch up on some of that deferred maintenance, specifically in our office complexes. And we've announced some major projects in the National Capital Region and across the country. That translates into investments in our workplaces. And then that translates into a co-working facilities. We have a pilot project running right now. Of course, not a very effective pilot when no one's in the office, but co-working facilities, which is really a remote office closer to your home. So fewer commutes and all of that. And all of those things, of course, were designed to improve not just productivity and workplace satisfaction, but get a more modern, collaborative type work atmosphere into the federal public service. And I think we all look forward to resuming those kinds of things. But as for ergonomics and network access and so on, I'm sure many deputy heads and departments have been very accommodating, but I don't think there's been any systemic or systematic overview of that.
Right. Jim, you mentioned technological advancement. Things like remote working have been talked about for a long time, and people thought it was something that would roll out over the next 5 or 10 years, and then suddenly it all happened over a week in March. Do you see this? Are we now getting further ahead in terms of remote working and our ability to interact technologically with our workplace and clients?
Well, I think they're good and bad to it. And I mean, as Dave mentioned, you see the people that are willing to stay longer and are working longer because they don't have the commute time, they don't have, all of the extra time they would need to get to work, or that takes up a lot of time. And I know from the negative point of that is that you've got not the social aspect of it, right? Because you don't have that collaborative. I mean, there are all sorts of collaborative tools, but you can only do so many Zoom calls, and it's not as collaborative as possible. But I think at the same point in time, the remote working piece has been fairly productive. You talk about the ergonomics and even the technology. So if they said, well, you're supposed to go back to the office half time, well, am I going to lug my computer back and forth all the time? Am I going to lug my ergonomic chair back and forth all the time? What's the point of going into the office to do Zoom calls with, so the technology is there, take advantage of it, and then spend that time in the technology and advancing some of the other things that need to be done to deliver services to Canadians. I mean, I mentioned the EI modernization, but there's so many things that you could do to sort of online access for citizens that you'd be able to use the technology. I'm from Kitchener-Waterloo, so I'm always going to be a big technological backer, and we have a lot of talent here in Canada that we could utilize the technology developed in Canada, to provide services for the public. And I think that the government I'm looking at you, Steve, in the sense of looking at some of what those are. We have a lot of programs that are available to adopt some of that technology for delivery of services, and we just have to accelerate that. And I think once the government starts to accelerate the adaptation of those multiple tools for all sorts of different services, we could create a lot of efficiencies and scale in order to better deliver services. So
yeah, okay, thanks. Linda, I want to go to you to talk about your aspect of the public service. You're the head of the Federation of Nurses Union, so your members are nurses across the country. So talk to us about nurses and healthcare workers who really could not work remotely. They did have to go to work for the most part, whether it's at hospitals or doctors' offices or visiting nurses or visiting patients or their clients in their homes. How has that affected them, and has their life changed a whole lot or just become more difficult with having to wear more PPE and all that?
Yeah. Before I jump into the healthcare force, if you don't mind, Andrew, I'll comment on the previous question, because it's important to realize how society has been divided by COVID. There's a part of society of workers that are like my members that work throughout. The overtime skyrocket, they had to be there. Grocery store workers, truck drivers, they had to be there, and part of them were very lucky because their neighbors were losing their jobs. But then there's the others, the professional group, where they either are working at home, the kids worried, are the kids stimulated enough? Am I doing enough? That stress level is an area that Stephen and the federal government, provincial and territorial governments are going to have to look at. Because what I feel from my colleagues and friends that have families, they're stressed to the limit. So if I flip back to the healthcare workforce, it is shameful that in Canada, 1 in 5 healthcare workers have been infected. And you think, how? Why? We know better. We have a public health sector. 1 in 5 has been infected. Doesn't mean that they were gravely sick. We still had about 60, we had sadly 16 healthcare workers that passed. Probably, and that 1 in 5, 2 that have been 2 in 5 that have been hospitalized. But we have a great healthcare system, so not many in the world of dead healthcare workers come from Canada. But we do have the highest level of healthcare workers that got infected, and it comes back to the PPEs. So everything I learned as a nurse to protect myself, my patients, my coworkers, and my family, on mid-March, it was all erased. It was whatever that province decided. And we had to go back at the bargaining table and negotiate personal point of care risk assessment to say, if I do a risk assessment and I need a certain PPE, I would get it. That is a nonsense in the occupational health and safety world. So that is creating a lot of stress. So I go to bed at night and a lot of sleepless nights since March, but mostly it's because I'm worried about, are these healthcare workers going to come back? Similar to what Stephen just said about Gatineau and nurses holding sit-ins. That issue of health human resource in Quebec, and especially in the Gatineau area, has been going on for 7-8 years, and COVID is just putting pressure. People don't realize that with all these emergency acts that have been put across the country, that means vacations were canceled, family leaves were canceled. You weren't going to be working in your unit. If you were called to go work in nights in labor delivery, you'd be going work nights in labor delivery, even if you've never worked there before, or if it was 10 years ago. No job posting, no promotion. All of that is taking a toll. And when I say we, it's employers, government, and / unions. We will have to look at that very closely starting in the fall.
Yeah, and talk to me about the effect for healthcare workers and their families. So they're working in a space that is, I don't want to exaggerate this, but relatively unsafe or dangerous. They're on the front lines of COVID. and then they're going home and interacting with their families, or sometimes they have kids or parents or whatever, or other family members who have underlying conditions. How has that worked out?
But at the beginning, it was a real mess, because one hospital would say, well, if you're a healthcare worker and your symptoms are only mild, you can still come into work. But if you're an office worker and you have any symptoms, you have to be home for the 14 days isolation. The issue of not having the proper PPE, the personal protective equipment, the issue of some facilities, you don't even have a place to go change. So whatever uniform I'm wearing, and God only knows what are on that uniform, I'm bringing it home. So you heard stories of nurses undressing at their front door. And we used to, and we gave them hints, put your dirty uniform in a pillowcase so you can throw it right away in the dryer with no other clothes. So when you're telling them a safety issue like that, put your dirty uniform with nothing else in the washer dryer. Well, I'm just about to welcome my kids. Then I need to go take a shower, and that whole stress. And of course, the stress of not having kids in school. Some were lucky. There were some daycares open, and others weren't. They just had to rely on partners, families, and friends. And it's been difficult.
Yeah. Can I take you all to the wider question of the issue of support for government? And then Dave, I'll start with you. So on the one hand, we've got a situation where I think a large number of people have suddenly realized that government workers, healthcare workers really make a difference in our lives. And public servants have really, for the most part, really met the bar that people expected. And, the bar was suddenly set very high. So on the one hand, there's people who have developed a growing sense of support or respect for public servants. On the other hand, there's maybe smaller in Canada, bigger in the US, and we hear about it a lot. There was a big demonstration here in Ottawa recently, a few of them, people against government telling them what to do in terms of the restrictions, whether it's work restrictions or wearing a mask or whatever. How do you see that playing out in terms of what people think about government and government workers?
It's been a very pleasant 6 months of relative nonpartisanship in relation to the pandemic. And I think everybody has sincerely appreciated that. We're starting to move away from that, unfortunately, with recent elections of leadership and so on. I think that was a nice break because people got the sense that they were actually working together, and they saw the value of the public service or the civil service as the backbone to all those activities. I think when Stephen and others speak out, regardless of their partisan connection, in favor of the public service and the civil service and the goodness that it does, that's a pleasant, opposite take on what often occurs from all of the parties of all stripes, where they routinely point at their own people as being the root of some sort of issue. But I think if we're going to maintain confidence in the public service in a longer fashion, we need to fix some of the problems. Like I was going to jump in when Linda was speaking. The most epic fail of all of this has been the long-term care world. It's just been a disaster for 20 years. Anybody that's connected to the medical world, myself included, will tell you that. We need to fix that. We can't treat our pets better than we treat our aging adults and parents and so on. And that's quite effectively what has gone on there. So until people see that you can actually get a full-time job working in a nursing home, and you don't have to work at 3 different nursing homes and infect them all so that you can feed your family, commonsensical things will really appeal. So whether it's at the Trudeau or the Ford level, taking actions that are going to fix some of the things that have been aired out and not shy away from it, I think will go a long way. And then maybe one final comment, because I always see the people I represent that they're privileged. And unions need to achieve sick leave for everybody. They need to achieve sick leave so that the people who are in grocery stores and transportation and some of the places that have been mentioned on our call today who don't have that actually have that, so that they can take time off and not have to return to the workplace and sicken the workplace and so on. So I think the most trustful thing that we can do is fix some of our problems and demonstrate why there should be a confidence, and that it's not a sudden appearance of competence. We've always been competent. It's just that we now have that opportunity, while things are mildly nonpartisan still, that we can, I think, attack some of those things.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of people have benefited by government directly, and so they're more aware of what it is, of what governments can do. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that, going to that point, I think that, the public service did it broadly, did an excellent job in the sense of that the frontline workers, and whether they be nursing, whether that be people in the school system as well, have done a fairly decent job. And I think that there's always going to be, you talk about the protests, and I think there's always going to be some people that are going to complain and say, oh, my rights have been taken away, or lack of freedom. I'm not quite sure I understand that, but I think the other thing, though, that again, I'll just reiterate sort of using this as a catalyst to actually demonstrate how we could fix some of the things in the system, so that we have more long-term planning, more preparedness by public service. So that some recent articles about the Global Public Health Information Network, and that we had something that was a warning system that did be able to better prepare for things. Linda, you mentioned that we had SARS, and then we had MERS and Ebola, and early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of news stories about how we weren't prepared because we didn't learn from SARS, just because we had the mismanagement of inventory of masks or PPE. So I think that longer term piece, where we have to look on a longer horizon, I think is something that the public service, and I think a lot of the public servants are willing to adapt to, and say, hey, we can't just look 2 feet ahead of ourselves. We have to be more prepared, and allow public servants to actually, whether they're on the front line or whether they're doing policy development or managerial, to actually come up with more flexibility for putting forth ideas like that, because otherwise you're going to always have the vocal sort of minority who are going to be out complaining about something that the public service has done. And on the flip side of that, all the calls for defunding the police, I mean, that's another thing, that it's a public service. And
can I just put you on the spot, Jim, and as somebody who has worked in a conservative administration, there will be a view that we do need to be watching the deficit, the growth of the deficit, and largely we're not talking about that now. Are there, there would be a view among some people that public servants have had their jobs secure, while a lot of people in the private sector have been laid off and lost their jobs. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think, and I alluded to that earlier when I was talking about the Service Canada, Service Ontario outlets not being open and not being able to service citizens, yet the kid from Starbucks or McDonald's is still out there. So yes, there's going to be a sense that there's too much job security within the public service, but I think at the same point in time, I think that there are going to be roles for sort of modernization and moving people from one particular task to another, so or particular function. So we might not need as many people doing one thing, but can they be put somewhere else in order to still deliver services? But the thing is you can't turn the ship that is the public service that quickly in order to adapt where all of the people are, in order to sort of, I don't want to use the word repurpose, but I'm going to use the word repurpose individuals to deliver services to Canadians. Again, with the job security thing,
maybe refocus.
Well, yeah, refocus. Thank you. There you go.
Okay.
But I think just one more thing is that
Okay.
in the job security piece, there's a lot of jobs where people, it says that they're temporarily laid off, but I'm sure there's going to be a big percentage that aren't coming back at all. And the public service is going to stay the same size. So that's where you might get a bit of pushback.
Okay, Linda, what are your thoughts on the question? I gather from the facial expression you want to jump in here.
Not to pick on Jim Day here, but the public sector, both federally, provincially, and territorially, are one of the largest employers in the country, and they did turn on a dime. They did answer new programs. It was impressive. I was teasing Stephen earlier. For the federal government to have moved so quickly was amazing. We've never seen that. So they knew how to move quickly, and the public service as a workforce adjusted and are still delivering services. Now that you couldn't get your license, I see it as a public health issue. We had to have rules for public health, and that is where the federal government did very well. But at the same time, too many messages. Those who are saying masks, for example, there's 1,001 policies out there. It doesn't make sense. Everyone should be wearing a mask if you're within 2 feet, 2 meters, especially if you're inside. There's no ifs, there's no buts. Why is New Brunswick or the Atlantic bubble different than Ontario? You travel to New Brunswick, you need to isolate 2 weeks, go back to Ontario, don't need to isolate. All of those mixed messages are really bringing confusion to the general public. So they say, well, if Ford is saying something and Premier Higgs is saying something else, well, I'll make up my own mind. And that's where the confusion is. But the rule of this game, especially in a pandemic, is public health rules. It's those directives we need to, and what is a must. It wasn't a must to go to Starbucks. But they were under the food regulation, just like Walmarts were open. Well, you just didn't go there for food. You could go buy a sweater if you wanted, because it was under the food. So those were rules that were made quickly. Look at BC, good on them. They expanded their rules. Bars in BC weren't respecting it. They closed them down. Now they have restrictions, like something like 10 p.m. you have to stop serving liquors. You think we're back in the 1960s, but you didn't follow the rules. The rules of public health should be golden, and everything else we need to adapt.
Thank you. Stephen, you're kind of at the center of all this as a member of parliament. You've got your word that's growing sense of respect for the public service, but yet you're hearing the pushback. And you folks have a throne speech coming up next week where you're going to, I hope, reimagine a lot of what federal government is about. What are your thoughts about where we need to go?
Well, let me give you a little picture, Andrew, of what it's been like to be the member of parliament for Gatineau for the last little while. In 2017, we had our first once in 100-year flood. 2018, we had a tornado that blew away an entire neighborhood in Hull. In 2019, we had our second once in 100-year flood. And in 2020, of course, we, like everyone else, we're not special, but we are full participants in a global pandemic. So it's been quite interesting to watch, not only up close as a result of representing so many public servants as I do, but just to watch the need and the necessity for a healthy public service and a healthy chose publique, appareil public in Canada. We required the armed forces for both of those floods, and to a limited extent during the tornado. We watched our healthcare workers, our municipal public works workers, police, of course, and first responders, and I shouldn't even start listing them, because watching all of the public employees swing into action during all of these things is crazy. But the thing that, to answer directly your question, and about the throne speech, one of the things I think we have to, as a society, come to grips with is that we have underfunded, consciously in many cases, some of those unsexy things over the years. IT networks, public servants' office buildings, or physical plant of all kinds. I invite you to visit the Hull Hospital. And I invite you to visit some of the district energy. We just, before the pandemic, announced an investment of billions of dollars into the district energy system in the National Capital Region. So many of these assets, programs, backbones, to say nothing of the employees that operate them and the demographic challenge that we are going to face when a lot of these people retire, require reinvestment. We've put off deferred maintenance on our public services for far too long. And I would include human resources planning in that. We need to think about la relève, who's going to take over for so many of these nurses, teachers, and public servants of all descriptions, and reinvest in recruitment and training and workplace satisfaction for all these people, and then reinvest in the places that they work and the systems that they operate and the equipment that they're able to use. All of these things are going to require a total rethink, and that has to be part of how we build back, because we have to get more resilient as a society to deal with these catastrophic events like pandemics, like floods, like tornadoes, like fires we're seeing right now, and so on and so forth. So those would be my thoughts with respect to the government's agenda going forward.
And can I ask you specifically what's going to be in the throne speech with regard to child care, seniors care, and basic income?
Well, I don't know that you want me to speak for the rest of this panel, Andrew. I do know, though, that the government has obviously spent a lot of time thinking about these gaps that the pandemic has laid bare in society. I think we know, to take but one of your examples on childcare, that full female participation in the workforce is very difficult. And that's an economic outcome, by the way. We need to rebuild our economy and rebuild it inclusively with all of the participation that we can muster, whether that be disabled Canadians, whether it be females, males, racialized Canadians. So we need to continue, as I said in the earlier response, enable these people to have full participation in the workforce and work on things like skills training, but also work on things like childcare that allow them to participate.
Thank you. I have a question for Dave and Linda. As you're a union leaders in major sectors of society, does the experience of COVID, and this goes to the question of la relève and revitalization that Stephen mentioned, do you sense that people will now want to come to your sector, or will they be thinking twice about joining your sector? I'm thinking about young people coming out of college and university. Dave?
Yeah, I guess, Andrew, maybe for those of us who are in safer, more secure positions within the public service, coming up with long-term solutions that Jim mentioned, and the planning and the strategy, and that might be exciting. I'm not sure how many people in the police, fire, ambulance, nurses, whether or not they're going to see an influx or the opposite of interested parties. But I think people are going to see the public service for what it's always been, a place where you can give back, a place where you can look after others, a place where you can have traditionally solid job security and good wages and salaries and so on. And I think there are a few places that, and I mentioned earlier, in the nursing world, where we need to realize that we've done a real disservice to the jobs in that sector by making them so part-time and so casual. And a lot of it has to do with demographics that Stephen just mentioned, where it's largely female, and we haven't given it the same respect, I don't think, that we have in what are largely male-dominated professions. So I think there's an opportunity to fix some of that and to make it more appealing for people to go into the civil or the public service.
Yeah, thank you. Linda, your thoughts?
I mentioned it earlier, that's what keeps me up at night, is how are we going to retain and recruit? Stephen mentioned you talked about human resource planning. We need health human resource planning, because there's a whole discussion out there on the care economy. It goes further than doctors and nurses and physios and that go. There's the whole care economy, and communities are going to start saying, what do we want for seniors care? Do we really want more buildings, or do we want somebody to come and help me in my home that has the training, that has the support mechanism, that has the full-time job and the benefits, and that feels part of the team, and not what we have now, which is a mishmash of for-profit organization, agencies all over the place. It has to be part of the collective team, which starts from the acute care in the hospital to your home. And how do we bring that together? And that's only, and I think it's the role of the federal government, is health human resource planning. Let's bring all the thinkers of this world in health human resource, and what can we do better for the country? Because Dave mentioned it earlier on long-term care. Embarrassing, just sickening and embarrassing. Yes, we had to call the Army. Yes, it was nice as a proud Canadian that the military could go in. But for those workers working in those facilities, was what is happening? And we have to take a serious look at that. And I'm a proud nurse, everyone knows. I say it in every corner. Nursing as a profession will still be there in 100 years. It is changing gradually, similar as medicine. You have very fewer and fewer doctors that want to work 100 hours a week. They want a life. You have fewer and fewer nurses who want full-time job and X numbers of overtime. They're still doing it, but they want a life. They want childcare. They want to make sure their parents are okay. They want a clean environment. So all of that we'll have to work together on.
Yeah, certainly when we think about healthcare workers or personal support workers and other people who work in seniors' homes and are paid minimum wage, we've really got to be rethinking some of that. It's always struck me more in the past few months, but just yesterday there was a story about the school buses in the Ottawa area where they don't have enough bus drivers. They pay the bus drivers minimum wage, $14 to $16, to be driving these large buses in charge of taking our darling little kids to school. And one driver got fired because he left one kid on the bus and went and parked the bus, but fortunately realized before leaving the kid there. But I mean, it's a terrible thing, but you think about it, he's getting paid $14 an hour to drive, to do a very secure and important job. And that's all we as a society give those drivers. So I think we've got to think through some of that. Mm-hmm. You can comment on that as you go through, but we've got some questions coming in. And Linda, the first one is for you. Regarding nurses who work in seniors' homes, should they be part of provincial staffing rather than of corporations?
But one of the key asks following the pandemic from Labor is that seniors care, long-term care, be part of the Canada Health Act. So the same principle that exists, the same rights you have for a hospital service, you would have for long-term care. And there's a lot of work being done with the federal government on how do we protect that. So that would answer the question. That means every long-term care, home care workers would be part of the provincial delivery, which now they're kind of part of, but they're not. And sadly, with COVID-19, all the deaths, we've had one RN that passed away, and he was working in long-term care, and all the others were workers that were just giving their 150% at close to minimum wage or a little bit more, and were scared to speak up because they were working part-time casual, or if they spoke up, their manager would get upset or lock more PPEs behind the doors. So yes, the answer should be it needs, healthcare is a national pride, it's a national right, it's a human right, and it needs to be publicly administered. And that includes when you're in a long-term care.
So how would you see that happening? So long-term care, and would it be retirement residence as well, would be managed under the Canada Health Act?
Well, that's a job for Stephen. He needs to establish a good project, Stephen. I'll help you. But we did it in 1997-ish, where the federal government had a national roundtable on long-term care, pharmacare, primary care. We wanted to reimagine healthcare. We didn't do anything after that. We reimagined it, we put it on paper, and then it was gone. We still have discussions to be done on pharmacare. As Stephen mentioned, childcare. Those are all issues we've been talking about for 20 years, 20 plus years. Now, seniors care, because of COVID, it really shook the cage. We realized somebody went inside and the military and said, for the love of God, what are you doing? Us healthcare workers, we've been saying, we've been telling you that for 20 years.
Yeah.
Somebody else went inside and said, what are you doing to seniors? So there's no politician that will get reelected, hint, hint, McKinnon, if they do not commit on something around seniors care. And that's looking at the big picture.
Stephen, on that note, a quick thought before I go to the next question.
Well, look, we've had not only the process that Linda just outlined in '97 with the Romano Commission. The country has gone through a number of bouts of self-reflection on what it means to operate a national single-payer healthcare system with a number of facets. Some of what citizens expect to be public healthcare is offered privately. And some of that's paid for by single payer, some of it's not. So you think of things like dental care or optical care or in many cases pharmacy and pharmacare. So we have a hybrid model, and it keeps the hybridization of healthcare has kind of continued apace. I think we're due for a national conversation about what is reasonable in a publicly funded single-player healthcare system. What can we afford, frankly? What are the human resources strategies? What can we uniformize? I have a major problem in Gatineau that many of my citizens can't get adequate healthcare in any kind of Quebec context, but they're not allowed to go to Ontario to get it either. So we don't have true portability, I should say, portativité. At least in the National Capital Region, and many Quebecers don't when they go across the country. So we have, like I just described in society in general, we have many gaps that we need to reflect upon. And we need to discuss with Canadians about it. And it's going to require, to be candid, a higher level of federal provincial cooperation than we've had to date, or at least that we've had in the last little while. The discussions about healthcare between federal government and provinces in my generation have tended to be how much, how big's the check, how big's the escalator, and things like electronic health, new national programs, seniors care, pharmacare, all of those things tend to be kicked to the side when we agree on a number. And I think we're well past due for a national conversation about things more than escalator clauses, and about what Canadians can and should expect from a public healthcare system.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew,
yeah.
can I just add one comment to that? I think you could actually apply that to the education and job training and skills development sector as well, because I think in the sense that you look at the need for better federal provincial cooperation on that, but also look at the issues around the demographics. You have all these people retiring, making sure that people have the right skills for the jobs that are coming up. There's a lot of jobs that are here now that didn't exist 2 years ago, and even in the future, they're not. We have no idea. But there has to be more of development around getting the education or the ability to, continuously learn, so that we are ready for the economy, jobs of the future, in the sense that the federal government looks after EI and all of the job training feature, but the education comes from the provincial government. So how do we integrate those? So I think from a healthcare standpoint, healthcare and education, I think, are in the same sort of boat. And you talk about human resources planning. Well, again, so I know that there's been a great number of efforts being made getting more people into, say, the skilled trades. Skilled trades are a great way to go. Same thing can be said for nursing and healthcare professions and all the different, things that are incorporated around the healthcare industry. But it's just a matter of that cooperation and education, I think, that's needed.
Thanks. Okay, we're fast running out of time. There were a couple of other questions, but I'm going to ask you each to give us a minute, your closing thought, and perhaps frame it in the context of either the throne speech coming up federally, or in your case, Dave, events in your province of Ontario. What's your one thing you'd like to see happening over the next while? And if you can each do it in about a minute, and we'll start with Dave, and then Jim, and then Linda.
I think maybe very specific to my world, Andrew, I think we have a huge opportunity to reshape the workplace of the future. Remote work has been amazingly successful. Coupling that with what is ahead of us with our artificial intelligence, we have an opportunity to create public policy that will assist us with both of those things. And on the remote work side, there's a win-win here where employees that I represent are going to have the benefit of working from home, hopefully in a hybrid system and not in an outright remote work way, in my opinion at least. And we have the ability for governments like those that Stephen participates in to actually achieve real savings through reductions in real estate by allowing people to work in satellite locations and remote places, and we can positively benefit from lack of transportation congestion and all the environmental issues of people rushing in and out of Toronto and Ottawa and so on. So I'd encourage people to look at it from a labor perspective, and what is it that we can do to reshape the workplace jointly, labor and management, for positive outcome.
Thank you. Jim? So you're muted, Jim.
I think one of the key things for me is around, you have to have at least one person that's done that, right? I think the key thing for me is that skills development and training. We've got all these income supports for people, but I think we need to shift them now for either upgrading or reskilling people that their jobs may not be coming back because of COVID. In the United States, they have introduced the Skills Renewal Act, which is it's actually bipartisan act that's been put forward to help people to get access to supports to get new skills and upgrading. And I think we have to look at that as we go forward as well.
Okay, thank you. Linda, your closing thought.
But for me, it's to try to flatten out the inequality. I think we all mentioned, I think it was Dave that mentioned, a lot of the public sector were quote unquote privileged because we had jobs that were guaranteed, either working at home or working in the office. I represent healthcare workers, was there, but so many were hit so hard because we didn't plan better. So that's key, and it's the inequality in healthcare. It should not matter if you're going into a hospital to have a beautiful, shiny baby, or if you're a senior needing care in a long-term care facility. We should have access to healthcare, mental health, pharmacare, and of course for families, childcare. I already wrote my letter to Stephen, so the list is longer than that. But it is important, and I think if every politician I meet virtually, it's think about tomorrow, think of a better tomorrow and how we can do it together. And the public sector proved to you that we can do good, and we can do very good as long as we're working together.
Stephen, last word to you. You've heard these wonderful thoughts. Now you take it to Parliament and make it all happen.
Yes, well, I do want to just conclude by thanking you all, and I think we've obviously found a lot of common ground on this panel today, but I do want to reiterate those unsexy things that help build the capacity of governments to respond to crises and to better execute their day-to-day mandates. They require reinvestment, and I'm really hoping that we can continue along that path.
Thank you, Stephen. Over to you, Francesca. You're muted.
Now, so a big thank you to Dave Bulmer, Linda Silas, Jim Miller, Stephen McKinnon. That was an absolutely fantastic discussion. So your discussion about public service in the future was extremely informative and encouraging, especially as we look at the broader public service at all levels of government and not just the federal level of government. As we reimagine Canada coming out of COVID-19, the role of the public service has been becoming clearer as we come to terms to a new sense of essential work. So in addition to thanking the fantastic panelists today, I'll also take this opportunity to thank the audience for joining us today, and remind all of you that we have one more webinar coming up this week. That will be on Wednesday, where we will be talking about cybersecurity with another excellent panel. And I'll invite you to think about cybersecurity as it relates to people working remotely. So that's on Wednesday. And in the meantime, I'll also take this opportunity to remind everyone that while these sessions are free to attend, we do invite you to visit the Pearson Center website at www.thepearsoncenter, all in one word, .ca, to make a contribution if you can. So on that note, I will thank everyone once again for joining us, and wish you all a great day, and stay safe, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.